can now listen to full-length, commercial-free episodes of the Divorcing Religion podcast on Patreon. Please sign up at patreon.com/Janice Selby or click the link in the show notes. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious recovery consultant. And today I'm so pleased to have my personal friend, Jennifer French, talking to us. Jennifer is a cult and religious recovery counselor. She has a master's in the psychology of coercive control and is a level 2 trained internal family systems counselor working across the US and internationally. Jennifer hosts the Project Hope podcast for families and friends with loved ones in a group of high control or high demand. She was a member of a Christian mystical cult for 11 years, and I'm glad to say she's been out for 10. Jennifer spoke this year at the Conference on Religious Trauma, and you can find out more about Jennifer and her work at jenniferfrench.com, and there is a hyphen between Jennifer and French. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, Janice. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for coming on our show. Your story is quite interesting because it's a little bit out of the ordinary. We tend to think, if we're talking about religious trauma, we're thinking of people who've left churches or more well-known cults, and you've come out of a Christian mystical cult experience. What was that like?
Yeah, so a little bit about that. It was heavily based because of the mystical component, which, we kind of think of as the more inner experience of Christianity. So we practiced a ton of meditation, very heavy on meditation. There were Eastern components, but also we worked with the Catholic sacraments. So we were serving communion and baptisms. It was mostly Bible-based. But for example, the way that we worked with the New Testament was very much, again, kind of with that mystical component, internal. So for example, our Bible contemplations, we would take a biblical story and look at the symbolism of each character and then apply that to our internal parts. So a little different in that regard. But also we were, taking from the Gnostic teachings, mystical rituals based, again, in kind of Eastern traditions like Paramahansa Yogananda's group, the Self-Realization Fellowship, where we were doing, ceremonies around self-realization. It also was, and this is very significant in terms of my group, teacher-student based. So kind of in this tradition of that would be a little more Eastern likely, but even honestly a good comparison, because I was also living in what we called a novice program and then running those programs, which was really like living in a modern monastery.
Oh, and was this in the United States?
It was, yes. And so we were solely based in the US. At the height of the group, we were in 13 different cities. So, yeah. Anyway, and the other important thing to kind of know about it that I'll refer to a little bit later and kind of describe the impact of this on me, that it was also very kind of high performance. And there was the entire kind of milieu of the group was this elevation into kind of spiritual enlightenment and personal spiritual evolution. So because of that, there were also definitely messages of kind of just really high performance and intensity around, kind of perfectionism and messages around that.
Wow. I'm curious about how you got into such a group. I mean, they weren't as well known as like the Moonies or the Hare Krishnas in the, kind of in public spaces like that. Were you approached personally?
That is such a good question. No, so at the time, I was in training to become a home birth midwife. And the midwife that I was studying with, my very first birth that I attended, the midwife that was assisting her was a part of this group. And she and I, because it was a long labor, we ended up in a room together, kind of trying to sleep, but stayed up all night talking about spiritual stuff. Mm-hmm. And she invited me to a workshop on Mother Mary. And I was intrigued. And that was the other thing that actually drew me in about the group, was that there was this concept really that Jesus and Mother Mary were equals, and that there was this balance in terms of masculine and feminine, which was very attractive to me and felt empowering. So that was a bit of a unique draw as well. Yeah. That's basically how I got in.
Have you been raised in a Christian environment where you were exposed to Bible teachings?
Oh, yeah. Another great question. So, I was raised Presbyterian, and it was really a traditional family value that was more around, we go to church to hopefully teach the kids some good moral messages. And that was kind of the extent of it. So it was sort of the scene in our family every Sunday where we had to get all dressed up with my mom. And then there was always a big argument of, why isn't Dad coming? It didn't want anything to do with it, but it was just kind of this, it was kind of the thing that everybody in town did.
Okay.
And so it was, it was more kind of based on just a social kind of thing.
Okay,
but I actually got really into it. So I got into the choir. I had friends that were in youth groups. So we all joined youth group, and we got to be together, 1 to 2 times a week and get out of our homes. So right from the beginning, actually, I always had something in me that definitely wanted a connection with God. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm sure that spirit was kind of alive in me. And even in high school and college, I was definitely, that took maybe more of a different experimental turn where we were, experimenting a little with drugs, reading the Bhagavad Gita, and I was with friends who were kind of all into that. So there was definitely kind of experimentation in that realm of the other.
Wow. Yes. Okay. So then in adulthood, you met this woman who was interesting to you. The things she was saying were intriguing, and invited you to a workshop or a retreat or whatever they called it. So that was kind of the gateway that got you in there. And then how long did it take before you were actually really kind of dangerously involved in the group?
Another very good question, Janice. I'm chuckling at it because so people can actually hear my story of how I got in and how I got out on the podcast that you mentioned, if they want kind of the full deal. But really, it was quite interesting because that very first workshop that I attended, I stepped into an environment that was unexpected. It was actually in a home, this workshop. And right away, I thought that was weird. And as I was approaching the door, I was kind of like, okay, what is this weirdness? I thought I was going like a lecture hall or something.
Right. Yes.
And I stepped in. I was greeted in the most lovely way. The day began with a lecture. During that lecture, people were so open in the questions that they were asking, and they were really personal and honest and revealing. And I, right then already, Janice, I kind of went, whoa, like this feels like my people. This feels like home. And then what I did was, because I felt open, I asked a question that was very personal, that was something I'd been struggling with in my family. And I asked it under the guise of asking for a friend. So, I was, I think I was 24 at the time. And so I asked this question for this friend that was personal, that was my question for myself.
Yeah.
And what was intense about that is so there were two leaders, a male and a female. And the male leader looked me right in the eye, and it was like he was piercing my soul and answered directly, perfectly for me. And I felt so seen and a little scared by it.
Mm-hmm.
But, again, I think part of the intensity intrigued me. I wasn't really afraid of it. I liked it. And so then what transpired is that we went into kind of this exercise where they divide into different groups. And this was a practice that we did at, every workshop that in the future I would end up leading. And they were called blessing groups. And we were taught that the person who's sitting on the chair and asking for a blessing, ask something sincere. The individuals around put their hands on the person, and you open to spirit and let the spirit flow kind of through your head, your body, through your hands. And you're just a vessel. Mm-hmm. And you just let happen whatever happens, simple. And then when the priest finishes praying the blessing, we take our hands off, the individual on the chair shares, and people in the group share if you want to. So I'll tell you, Janice, I sat there when I was being given instructions in my head, I went, I'm not letting these people touch my body. Like, hell no. That's still the mentality that I was in. Mm-hmm. But what happened is that the first woman who sat on the blessing chair asked for something very personal that she was having difficulties with her husband and wanted some insight into this. Mm-hmm. And during the blessing, what I saw was, I kind of had this experience where I saw this sort of infinity figure 8 starting to move between her and her husband. And I just sat there, and I was definitely a little blown away by it, but I just, again, kind of remained simple about it. And when that happened, I said internally to myself, like, I'm not sharing that. That's sort of weird. And, I'm just going to not say anything or share something mild. And the woman on the chair went to share her experience. And that is exactly what she saw.
Wow.
And so I had this experience of kind of going, this is confirmation from God that there's something really real and special and magic happening here. Mm-hmm. And so honestly, Janice, I can say from that first day, I walked out of that blessing group. I signed up for my 7-week Tree of Life class, or my 6-week Tree of Life class on the mystical teachings. And really, I was pretty sold from that moment on. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, the controversy about my story, and this is where, right away, there was something very unhealthy going on. And it was, even in those early days, a part of me knew it was unhealthy. And a part of me could not help but attach to the elements of truth in what they were saying to me. So this big thing started that was all about me being too attached to my family and needing to basically cut them off.
Wow.
And that was a process that took place over 3 years that was tremendously painful.
Yes.
And basically, my internal experience of that was this tearing of really trying to get on board, within that cult mindset, that I had to choose God and life with God and devotion to God, Jesus and Mary, above the worldly family. And I had been very close with my family. So it was a very bizarre, bumpy ride, where literally, I was trying so hard to explain things well. So I literally just kind of try to take the exact words that my teacher was giving me to parrot back to my family to try to explain things. And I just kept thinking that I was going to be able to convince them that what I was doing was good,
right,
amidst their concerns that were arising.
Oh, they must have been terrified for you.
They were.
Terrified of losing you.
They were.
Yeah. And so you were quite close to your family, yet it sounds like there also was something going on around that time, because when you attended the first meeting, you had a question that you said, I have a friend who has this problem, but that it was actually about you. So you were vulnerable in that sense, and you always had kind of a craving for spirituality or spiritual connection. So you're a vulnerable young person looking for more, and
yes,
you ended up there.
And actually, it's really it's interesting that you picked up on that, Janice, because I think truly, if there was a vulnerability, that was it. It was that I was in a time where I needed to really, I was really exploring an issue within our family. And probably the truth is, left to my own devices, I may have needed a little distance for a short period of time. But what ended up happening was that they used that. And I ended up not speaking to my parents for 8 years.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And so that was really, it had a huge impact, of course. Interestingly enough, when I got out, my family actually kind of plays a role in that. They did a lot to try to intervene and get me out, which never really worked. It was just, I think there was too much that I had received in terms of the group messaging and really adopting, that entire belief system. I mean, I was devoted and I bought in hook, line, and sinker. I really wasn't one of those people that at different points was like seriously questioning the teachers, what they were saying, what we were being told. I really just kind of went along with it in la land of love.
Yes.
And so in some ways, it's such a bizarre experience to have within that context. I really felt very well, actually, for 8 years of my life.
Because a lot of your needs were being met. Like we have a need for purpose and a need for feeling useful. When you talk about the person sits in the chair and everyone else is going to be a sort of spiritual conduit to help that person receive messages. People want to feel useful, especially if they think in terms of God speaking through them. But that makes everyone in that whole situation vulnerable.
Yes. Well, and Janice, I'll give you a little, you'll love this. So in my group, and this is why I call my group also a cult, because it really was a guru-student relationship. And so the teachings in this group, part of the spiritual evolution of the individual and how they would rise in the ranks and potentially be ordained a priest, which is, what I did and wanted and functioned that way for many years in the group leading it. What the kind of foundation of that measurement was that we were taught a particular way to connect with God within. And so you would go within to a specific place within and ask questions of God and receive answers. And this was the training. And you were supposed to do this with anything and everything. So pretty quickly, I mean, this isn't natural for a lot of people, right? Somehow this technique did actually resonate with me and felt fairly accessible. And so in some ways, that was a really beautiful experience for me. Mm-hmm. But here's where it gets warped. Who's the person that is able to tell you if that guidance is totally clear or not? Mm-hmm. It's the teacher, mm-hmm. who apparently has direct access to God.
There we go.
And can hear the exact voice of God. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So this was it really falls into absolute classic cult, mm-hmm. And the entire dynamic of that. And that actually, Janice, was, a huge part of, I'll speak a little to that later, but in terms of healing and information, to truly understand some of these dynamics it helped to unravel all the confusion around, all the wires got crossed, mm-hmm. Love and God and my sense of self and, all these very deep, important things. And this is why, right, spiritual abuse and religious abuse is so horrific, because it takes these pure parts of us and these parts that are so good and that care and want to be good and just manipulates in a way that the individual doesn't even know that it's happening. The little frog in boiling water, and mm-hmm. all of a sudden you realize you're fried.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like those parts of us get hijacked.
Yes. Right.
Wow.
And truly, I didn't. So you asked how I got out. That was a really interesting process as well, because that process for me happened to be very dramatic. It began with my ex-husband in the group, who was an arranged marriage partner within the group. Mm-hmm. He was the one where things started to break and he started to question. And he was an emergency room doctor. So very, based in medicine and research and all of that. And so the way he went through his own process, which, by the way, he did silently apart from me. So I knew he was going through something. Mm-hmm. I was relaxed about it because I knew he'd share it with me when he was ready. Mm-hmm. But he was literally kind of in a silo going through something for about 3 to 4 days. And when he introduced this to me, I think we're in a cult. He literally had an entire room in our house of Post-its with all the information and connections and sorting through this. I mean, he went through a very methodical process, kind of researching and deconstructing this.
Wow.
And actually, one of the really helpful things for him was he saw an actor, Jason Behe, who was a part of Scientology. And online, he had given a lecture to the government of Australia, I believe. It was some sort of government where he was kind of standing trial a little bit against Scientology. I'm not sure if it was a legal proceeding necessarily, but that was one of the things that really helped him kind of snap out of it and go, whoa, this is just like some of what we have experienced.
Wow. So the internet existed when you were going through this, when you were in this cult, and that was super helpful to your former husband, for him recognizing what was going on. Had you been warned by the guru? don't believe anything you read about us, or just don't go on the internet, those kind of typical things that we think might come from cult leaders.
Right. Even deeper than that, Janice, because what actually happened was there was a whole generation that kind of joined just before me. I was kind of the next wave. So I was kind of one of the originals in this particular group. And it was very, of course, the group evolves and changes a bit over time. But it was, I'm sorry, what was your question? I just lost my.
Had the leader specifically advised you not to go on the internet to try and research and find out about the group?
Right. So what happened was very early on, and this is actually why this tension began right away between my parents and I. News actually broke that we were a cult. And a news station picked it up. And as soon as that news broke, the teachers went right into a mode where they, did all this research. They literally went through the list of what makes up a cult and combated every single one. So we knew exactly what to say. We knew exactly what to say to the public. We knew exactly what to say to new people who would come into the group. They even went to the extent to tell us, to debunk brainwashing, which is just interesting to me now. Of course, this is an area of expertise for me. And the way that brainwashing works is within an environment, a contained environment, it absolutely does work. And we know that, and we've seen that, and there's a ton of research on that. And the original research is Robert J. Lifton's work, studying prisoners in the education reform camps. In Korea and the communist China. So this whole dynamic of what was happening was so clearly that it's to a T, those elements of manipulation happening. And what happens with quote unquote brainwashing or thought reform is that once you get out of the environment, and this is for all the people listening to who need a little hope or who feel like, seriously messed up, it is true that when we get out of these contexts, that we are able to return to ourselves, that we're able to reconnect and find, our authenticity and the aliveness of who we are, the ways that, that the creative force moves through us that's so uniquely us. And that is something that is so precious. It's one of the things I think coming out of an 11-year experience of that and all the regrets and the hurts and all that stuff. Truly, it's one of the things that I continually return to as something I breathe in, right? Of like, I am free to live and move and have my being exactly how I am moved to have it.
Yes. That's so. Just taking us back for a moment, your husband at the time, he said, I think we're in a cult. He showed you his reasoning, his Post-it notes, how he got there. What was that like for you? Did you have to immediately reject him and end the relationship, or what went on at that point? Because this is something that does happen when people leave religion. They have an awakening and they say, oh, this is not what I thought it was. I don't want to be in this anymore. And then they're married and they have children, and it can be so difficult to navigate.
Right. And this is when we're talking, this is one of the symbols, I believe, of unhealthy groups. When we are so trapped in that environment that a healthy, loving marriage, as one segment of the example, can't exist without being threatened if one individual starts to think differently.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think, again, I mean, if we are living that way, then we're trapped in ourselves, right? We have to be able to think and move and be in the ways that we naturally would and explore. I mean, that's true life moving. And so I'm sure many people who are listening right now will be able to relate to this. I knew when he presented that information to me that I had a choice. If I didn't listen to him, so there was the temptation to not listen, because I knew that if I listened to him and I opened to this, it meant my entire world was going to fall apart.
Yes.
And even touching into that for the first time, because this was really the first time I even tried that on. It was so foreign to me. It was that thing that I'm sure so many others can relate to. That first moment where you kind of go, holy shit. Could this really be not what I think it is? So I also knew there was something in me that said, I am married to this man. I must honor this marriage and give him the respect. I mean, I know him. I love him. He's a really good person. It is right in honor of this marriage to try on what he's saying. Because what am I afraid of? Why wouldn't I try it on? If it's real, I'll know. And if it's not, I'll know. Why would I be afraid of new thoughts and ideas? Right. And that was something always that rubbed me a little the wrong way in the group of kind of the shutdown of others or other ideas. I mean, we were definitely isolated in terms of information. But in that moment, I had to stretch into it, but I said to myself, yes, I'm going to do this because why wouldn't I? What am I afraid of? So I did. And it started to rock my world.
Yes.
We went through a major process over the course of 2 days. Now, unfortunately, what was also happening was that, there's this teacher-student alliance. And so I was also connecting with my teacher. So amidst trying on what my husband was telling me, the teacher was also telling me now, he is of the darkness.
Oh, no.
He has gone to the dark side. The devil has taken him over. He's got satanic forces in him. And honestly, that was scary to me. That wasn't really common language for us at that point. I think things kind of shifted a little bit. But what ended up basically transpiring is I tried it all on and it messed with me. It opened things up for me. And I went, now I have serious questions of my own because I see that some of these things that he's saying are right and accurate about us.
Wow.
But in this whole framework of kind of empowerment and also the messages that they had trained me in particular in about myself to ward off this possibility that I would ever choose my husband over God, they were always sort of sliding in these messages around, if I chose him, I would be the little woman versus being the empowered priest that had a mission to serve and to give. And that was torturous. That was a torturous decision.
Oh, insidious.
Yeah. But what happened, so unfortunately, and maybe fortunately, who knows, it's incredible to me that there is some trust that I have come to around kind of the beauty of how each person leaves and maybe what we each need in terms of that, like what gets tested in that process. So I said to my, now ex-husband, I said to him at the time, I have my own questions, and in my own integrity, I now have to address these directly with the teachers. And so we had a retreat that I was already kind of scheduled to go to. One of the teachers paid for me to get on a flight the next day. I mean, they wanted me out of there and out of his influence. So I did that. And as soon as I landed, that teacher picked me up. I dove right into my questions. She answered each one perfectly sculpted for me. And within 2 hours, I was basically kind of sucked back in.
Wow.
However, a little bit of a veil had parted, right? So now I was seeing through a bit of a different lens, and that kind of helped the rest of the process of unfold. And what essentially happened right at the end, I think it was about 3 months from that moment on until I actually left. And what actually happened at the very end, the real thing that kind of broke for me was I basically confirmed that the teachers had lied. Let me actually say it this way because it feels better, that I realized they were liars. And when I got that, I was done. It was like that broke the entire spell for me.
Wow.
And then as I actually kind of removed myself, I also just had, kind of this bizarre process where I really felt, I felt a spiritual kind of being taken care of around it all. I mean, it was so traumatic. But in that process, it was really interesting. It was kind of like I got a download of information very quickly about all the indiscretions, all the weird stuff, all the wrongs. And that felt like a real gift. It was sort of like when the clouds parted, they parted big and the jigsaw puzzle came together, which just felt like a kind of, grace-filled process, to use the, Christian terminology.
Yeah. So did you call your parents right away?
So also, interestingly enough, there's a whole component of family stuff that went on where the exact week that my husband was going through this process, I had my first conversation with my brother in many years. And it created a little bit of a platform of communication and connection back into family. So after I left, I think I had already scheduled a lunch with my brother. And so I showed up at this lunch and I let him know that I was out. And, I'll never forget that moment. I mean, he burst into tears. I burst into tears. It was kind of like immediate connection, again, kind of in terms of that, that whole dynamic that happens within thought reform. It was kind of like, well, he will definitely say that for a while later, I was using the language of the group and still felt different. And of course, I was sorting through so much. It was crazy. But really, there was no, I knew what I wanted from that moment on. I knew I was out. I was never going back. And I knew there were seriously unhealthy elements. And I also knew that I needed to reconnect with family. So what actually happened right then and there is my brother said to me, would you like to move into my New York apartment that was our family-owned apartment with 2 bedrooms? And my now ex-husband at the time, when I got out, he kind of said to me, everything of that has to die, including the marriage, and anything that was real will continue to live.
Wow. So
he and I very much maintained a friendship, but we got divorced and it really happened quickly. And in some ways, I'm really grateful that he kind of had that clarity so that really it might sound odd, and I don't really know why. There are many guesses I could make around it. But honestly, it was kind of easy to divorce.
Okay.
It was sort of like we had this lovely friendship. We had this scheduled cult sex once a month, as we were dictated to do.
Wow.
One day a month scheduled. And we were great friends and we respected each other. And so in some ways it was quite easy, actually. And then we both could move on. And that year for me post cult was definitely a heavy process around, reconnection with family, massive reparations. I mean, all that I missed, deaths that I missed, funerals that I missed, marriages that I missed, circumstances that maybe I could have helped a family member and I missed. There were so many things, and just, the trauma to my family was tremendous. In fact, Janice, I'll share something a little personal here. In my season 2 of my podcast, I felt like it might be nice to open it with a story from my brother and my father's perspective, because I opened season 1 with my story. And we've been talking about it, for a few months. And my father is he's a very kind of efficient man. He knows exactly what he wants. He's very confident. He doesn't care what anybody thinks. And he, is very self-determined, etc.
Mm-hmm.
I reached out to him a number of times, with my brother about potentially doing the podcast. And really, he was kind of dragging his feet on it, which again is unusual for him. And finally, about 2 weeks ago, I kind of said, okay, like the timing's right. How do you feel about it? And he said, I'm really sorry. I can't do it. It's too emotional for me to talk about it now.
Wow. All these years later.
All these years later, Janice. And, that's part of that impact. It's like for him to go back, it's his way of coping. Mm-hmm. And for him to go back into those memories is just too hard.
Mm-hmm.
So, we'll hear things from my brother's perspective, but It was just incredibly emotional, and everyone who knew me and knew my family was just blown away that this could even happen and that I was gone for 11 years.
Yes. And is the cult still operating?
So the male leader is still functioning and has a crew of people. I don't know, my guess or estimate is they're around probably like 20-ish people. And they're very isolated. They have been for many years now. My observation there, unfortunately, is that I do see things kind of escalating in terms of the unhealthy things and the abuses that are happening.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see kind of what unfolds, but, it's very disturbing.
Did they give you a different name when you were in the cult?
Oh, yes. I had 3 names and I diligently changed them legally. So, Janice, I've changed my name 5 times legally. And actually when I got out, the embarrassment around that, of applying to jobs and having to reveal that I've had these different weird names,
mm-hmm.
Reverend Monica, and then changing last names and maiden names. And so it just, the repercussions were huge. And, one of the things that you also kind of asked about in terms of what was like helpful in terms of healing.
Mm-hmm.
um, that was such an interesting, it's been, I will just say it's a journey. And even now I discover different nuances, different layers, different insights that I'm having.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first got out, the family reparations were critical, creating that foundation again. I mean, again, others have very different family relationships, but, mine have been really good in so many ways. So I'm grateful to say that, we're all very much connected now. I live very close to my brother and his whole family. My husband now, who actually was in the group with me.
Wow.
And so he is 11 years older than I am. He and his ex-wife had 3 kids together. So I saw those kids grow up. And now, we're in this blended family, and their mother was a great friend of mine that amazingly, to her credit, was able to continue. And so, there's really, she stayed with us a number of weekends ago. We had a lovely time together. We connect around the children. So, that's all kind of amazing in lots of ways.
You're surrounded by loving, supportive people.
Yeah. Yeah. But then when I first got out, also connecting with others who got out of my group was so critical. Honestly, I wasn't ready to really receive information yet. And, my parents, of course, had determined that I was in a cult. It didn't take me long to start calling it a cult. That felt kind of empowering to me, like a little FU. But actually learning about that kind of an environment and what happens in it, I really didn't do until much later. So initially, the other thing that was super helpful was really realizing that I needed to get compassion on board, compassion for myself, what I had been through. And also it felt so good coming out of the environment that I had been in, because I'm sure many can relate to this. Again, the whole, us, them mentality. We have the word of God. We know everything. We have the truth. Creates a whole environment of judgment of others and evaluating others. And I just hated that. It was never really my nature, but getting out and really kind of claiming the compassion again, where I didn't have to think critically about others and sort of evaluate them, was so freeing. The other element is, and this is very much a value that I, hold today, is never wanting to shut down conversation. So in terms of kind of beliefs and, what I've been through in my own kind of evaluation and sort of openness and experimentation around questioning my belief system was really freeing and empowering. Because again, actually, it's a funny touch point, Janice. The thing I often return to is, I'm not going to live in fear. Why would I be afraid of beliefs? So I go into curiosity around that. And that has really opened up all these new worlds that have created great value for me. And so, even diving into, well, first of all, I guess I should backtrack for a second. Well, no, I'll complete that thought. So really experimenting, researching other religions, belief systems, atheism. I love watching some of the debates, of Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens. And, to me, I want to be free. And so I am in a constant seeking to understand and explore and appreciate people and cultures and belief systems. Because the truth is, when you come across, I mean, especially religious wise, you certainly know this, Janice, where, if you start researching or getting to know people in other, for me, in other cults, right? Eastern cults, exactly the same. Fundamentalist Christian groups, exactly the same. Maybe minus a super controlling leader. It kind of depends.
It depends.
It depends. I mean, listening to the Mars Hill expose and Mark Driscoll, samesies.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating to go, oh yeah, there are people all over the world that are completely convinced that they have the truth. So let's all consider that. What does that mean?
Yeah.
I mean,
not being afraid to explore it.
Right.
It's so true, because curiosity really does open up. It expands the world for us, whereas fear and judgment, it closes it. It really contracts the world. And so that's something I work with my own clients, is just encouraging them whenever they can to swap out judgment for curiosity. Because when we're coming out of these fundamentalist groups, we've been taught to be extremely judgmental and critical and fearful of everything that falls outside of our group. So we need to instead just pull up a seat at the buffet table of life, the banquet buffet table, everything as far as the eye can see. There's all these beautiful dishes. Fundamentalism would have us starve to death at that buffet table. And the truth is, we're allowed to take a bite of every dish. If we're not breaking a law and we're not harming someone, we can try it. We don't have to continue with it. If we take a bite of something and it doesn't agree with it, we can just no thank you and move on. And we don't have to beat ourselves up about it. It was an experience that we had. We're kind of gathering experiences, so we can just move on to an experience, a new dish that we might like so much. We go back for seconds and thirds and fourths because it really resonates with us, and we don't have to judge ourselves around it. And that's so freeing.
So freeing. That's just what I was going to say.
Yes. Yeah.
So freeing, goodness. And also because, I think in a lot of these groups, I think also in some of the Christian, more fundamentalist sects, there is that flavor that I experienced of kind of this elevated perfectionism for God.
Yes.
Right? And it put such a great pressure on each one. And so what I also love about what you just said is that there's this freedom in being human, in making mistakes, and the beauty of mistakes, because we learn. And I'm always kind of, for me, my foundation is really the way I really move from my being is my intuition. It really is. And that's been a process, right? That's a muscle that we pay attention to and it grows. And so all those things of kind of like, is this something that feels good to me to experiment with right now? Yes. And if I know that I was in my own integrity experimenting with that, then if it's wrong, I just learned something. And it's so refreshing again to just be human. I often have this conversation, around kids and parents, right? Where it's kind of like, you can just apologize to them and you get to teach them the great gift that you too are human. And so they can be human, and it gives them permission to be human, not perfect.
Yes. Oh, wow. I love that. Permission to be human, not perfect. Yes, that's because perfectionism, it's such a trap. It's such a trap. It's unattainable, and it just keeps us on that treadmill going faster and faster and faster. And it, it'll burn us out. This has been such a delight hearing your story in greater detail. Thank you for sharing it with us. And people can go to your website, jennifer-french.com. And are there links there to your podcast episodes?
Absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you again for spending time with me, Jennifer. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Janice. It's such a pleasure to have you as a friend and colleague and to be engaged in this work with you. You're doing amazing things, and I feel privileged to be a part of it.
Oh, I feel the same. So I'll just remind everyone to subscribe to the Conference on Religious Trauma YouTube channel so you never miss an episode of the Divorcing Religion podcast. And I'll encourage people also to get their tickets for Shameless Sexuality, Life After Purity Culture. That's our upcoming conference. And I'll even ask that you consider supporting me on Patreon. That's all for this week. Thanks again, Jennifer. Take care, everybody.